Amazing. Thanks for having me. It's really a real highlight to come along here. And we've really enjoyed the Sundays we've come already. I come without my technical assistant today, so I hope everything works all right. Al was planning to come, but then had to lead the service in Oxford. And I believe a few students of ours were with you last week, and they were really buzzing about it when I saw them on Thursday at the student night. So it was so great that they could come. They just talked so animatedly about joining in. They were like, "It's amazing! It was so good." So we were so encouraged, because you quite often suggest that people go along, and then you ask them if they actually went, and they're like, "Oh, no, I stayed in bed," or something. So I believe that you've been going through Isaiah, and I'm quite excited to look at Isaiah 58. It's a passage I've always really loved. I guess it's quite a famous passage in terms of thinking about how to live rightly. So it's really fun to kind of be able to look at that with you today. I'm going to read the passage in a second, but I guess this is probably very familiar as an example of how to live rightly and justly before God. And it's a brilliant passage in terms of telling us how to do that. But I found that the more I dug into it and the more I looked at this passage, the more I realised that rather than just telling us what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing, actually it was really addressing our hearts and telling us how we can offer worship that's more acceptable to God. So, and whilst that involves works, actually it's really clear that this is about where our hearts are and whether our hearts are open to God and close to God. So I'm gonna briefly go through the passage, but then I'm going to come back and think about it in terms of how our hearts are. So I'm going to read it, which is Isaiah 58, the whole thing. So feel free to follow along. Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what's right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near to them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you not noticed? Yet on your day of fasting, you do as you please and exploit your workers. Your fasting ends in quarrelling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I've chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke. To set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. Then your light will break forth like the dawn and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls and restorer of streets of dwellings. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honourable, and if you honour it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride and triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Gosh. I think this particular passage really gets to the nub of challenging pride and empty religious rituals and at the same time having your hearts far from God. It looks a lot at appearances and people wanting to seem really pious and holy to everyone else, but actually pointing out that God can see our hearts and is not pleased. I was talking to Al and thinking, I need to have a good image for this, and he suggested this actually. And this is in Skopje, I think you pronounce it. And it's a city where they basically have decided it needs to look more kind of ancient and more kind of historical. And so what you can see here is looks like a really impressive kind of marble colonnades and stuff like that, but actually you can see it on the right. It is all just kind of, it's not polystyrene, but essentially it's not marble, it's all just kind of a facade on the front of a building that is a much more modern building. And I think that gives us a really nice, image of actually the outside looking really quite impressive and actually the inside being really not that impressive. You can tart it up really nicely, but actually it is still just that building that was built however many, 50 years ago or something. And this is what this passage is looking at. It is looking at shallow worship. There's a lot of loaded language in this. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what's right. They seem eager for God to come near to them. And this passage is about God wanting us to obey him because we love him, not because we're trying to twist his arm and trying to get him to act in a particular way. One of the commentaries pointed out actually that this is behaving in quite a Canaanite way, where they felt like by acting in a particular way they could pressurize God into doing what they wanted him to do. It's kind of a way of sort of fasting to twist his arm and get him to do something. And God doesn't respond to that, and he longs for us to draw close to him and do things because we love him and do things because they're right. I'll pick that up a bit later, but this is about exposing shallow worship. But not only that, this passage points out that not only were the people worshipping kind of with a veneer, but that they were acting far more unspiritually than they normally would be. There's nothing quite like fasting, I find, to enhance our unspiritual traits. You feel grumpy and irritable, and it can be a real challenge. But I don't think this is just pointing out on that. Yeah, there's a bit of that, but it's actually pointing out the hypocrisy of, on the one hand, doing something that seems so spiritual, and on the other hand, kind of accentuating the worst of your characteristics. But the people were doing this and they just weren't getting it. They were clearly asking, why aren't our prayers being answered? There's that wonderful bit which sounds a little bit, I can imagine a foot stamp in it with a kind of, why have we fasted and you not seen it? It sounds like a kind of child trying to get somebody's attention really here, doesn't it? And God's response to them was really clear that the behaviour that they were exhibiting was resulting in God just not hearing their prayers. He says, you cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. I'm going to turn along. So this is about a call to right living. And God has a lot to say about how people should live. And I'm going to kind of rattle through a few of these points. And then as we go on, I'll come back and pick up a few of them. But I think this can be broadly broken down into two sections of stopping living in a bad way, stopping acting wickedly, and starting acting rightly. So it talks about what to not do and then what to do. So this is the stop acting wickedly. It talks about getting right with those around you. It talks about loosing the chains of injustice quite a lot, untying the cords of the yoke, setting the oppressed free, breaking every yoke, doing away with the yoke of oppression. There's 3 yokes in there. And actually that is all to do with imagery of oxen. Oxen were yoked together, and it was all like they were animals. They had to be yoked together in order to it was a heavy burden on their necks, and it kept them together and it kept them doing their work. And there's something in it of people being treated wrongly and burdened with the yoke of slavery. It talks about no pointing the finger or blaming people, no malicious talk. But instead, God's chosen fast is about caring for the needy and making society just. Being those who don't engage in gossip or idle chatter, but who take I love the verse in Ephesians 4:29. It talks about, let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful in building others up, that it may benefit those who listen. God's made my speech be like that. That's a high bar, but it's a good one. And then starting acting rightly or lovingly, it talks about sharing your food with the hungry, providing the poor wanderer with shelter, clothing the naked, not turning away from your family, spending yourselves on behalf of the hungry, satisfying the needs of the oppressed, keeping your feet from breaking the Sabbath, being prepared to open your homes and practice hospitality and looking after those who need it. And then it talks about the resulting blessing from all of these things. It says, your light will break forth like the dawn. Healing will quickly appear. Righteousness will go before you and the glory of God will cover after you. So it's talking about being in a secure place. God hearing our call and answering us. Our light rising in the darkness. Satisfying our needs in a sun-scorched land. Being a well-watered garden with never-failing waters. Rebuilding ancient ruins and raising up age-old foundations. Joy in the Lord and feast on inheritance. And we're gonna come back on some of this stuff. But when I was praying about this passage, actually, there were two things. First of all, I felt specifically for you guys on the leads, I felt like God was saying, I see what you do and how you choose to live your lives, and I am so pleased. And yet there's an invitation to come further up and further in. I love those words. They're from the last Narnia book, but it's all about further up, further in. Just when you think you're somewhere wonderful, actually there's more up and there's more in to go, and it gets bigger and bigger and better and better. And all of this comes from a loving and proud Father who looks at you guys with the eyes of love and yet asks you to lean in more and get closer to his heart. So there was an affirmation but also an invitation in higher. And the other picture I had when I was praying about this was of a drain that was clogged up. And I guess this kind of, to me, encapsulates this passage of like, these people were asking why God wasn't hearing them. And I had a picture of a drain that was just clogged up and the water was not flowing. There was just too much muck in the way. And then as we look through the passage and as he talks about taking things out that was wrong, it was like handfuls of muck were being removed from this pipe. And then actually that exposes that in the pipes there are a few holes and a few cracks here and there. But as we learn to put in what is right, it's like we're shoring up that pipe. And then actually as we get to the end and it talks about the blessing, it's like the water can freely flow through the pipe again. There's living water at the end of this process, and it's all about seeing that kind of flowing freely again. So I'm gonna look at this through that imagery. So I wanted to entitle this really, Where Are Our Hearts? And I felt like this was all about our hearts. You can't take the heart out of any of this. And thinking about true worship. So it says in this passage, is this the kind of fasting I've chosen? I mean, God sees our hearts and we can't fool him with religious rituals. We might be able to do a really good job of fooling those around us. And, I bet probably every one of us at one point or other has managed to do that. Not meaning to, but I certainly know that, I don't know, it's really uncomfortable preparing a passage like this because it just is like a big mirror to yourself. And, I think about the times where, I've maybe been scrolling through Facebook and Al's come in and I've put my phone away and got out my Bible and you think, oh gosh. But actually, God sees our hearts and knows where we are trying to appear one way. And I want to just point out at this point, there is nothing that is wrong with religious rituals. They are good things. There are great things said about fasting in the Bible. There are great things said about prayer in the Bible. And yet both of them have examples of people using them in wrong ways. So fasting, this passage, but I was also thinking about the praying, where there was the tax collector, and it was either a Pharisee or a rich man, but basically you have the kind of much more prominent man coming out and giving this big kind of, oh Lord, I give this much to the church and I do this, and this big kind of very prideful prayer in front of everywhere. And then you have the tax collector kind of falling on his knees in a back room like, God, who am I? Woe to me, a sinner. And Jesus pointing out that's the kind of praying I want. And so obviously at no point is God saying in the Bible praying is wrong. It's just a reminder to check our hearts, whatever we're doing. So let's just make sure that we don't throw fasting out with all the other rubbish it talks about in this passage. So it's a reminder to check our hearts. Making sure that we're not doing things to try and twist God's arm. He doesn't respond to that. Fasting's about humbling ourselves. And at the same time, we fast and pray to see breakthrough in those areas. And sometimes there can be like a tension between those things, can't there? Because you can think, I'm going to fast and I'm going to see breakthrough. But it's not about a key to success. There's something in fasting which is about humbling ourselves and being at a point of desperation and crying out to God to break through. And God cares why we do what we do. I was thinking about this in terms of parenting. I want my kids to do what's right because they know it's right and because I've brought them up to do what's right. And I also, I want them to do, I want them to do good things because I know that they'll please, that they'll bring joy to me and Al, and that they'll please God. I don't want Elise to act in the right way because he wants to earn his Minecraft time on the computer. Like that, that whilst it's a good thing that he's doing, actually the heart motive's all wrong, and that sort of affects what he's doing. And likewise, God longs for us to do the right thing because we kind of love him, because we've grasped something of how he wants us to live, and because we want to obey him. I guess the natural outworking of this passage is to highlight that sometimes there's a desire to seem better or holier or just other than we actually are, and keeping our eyes open as well to religious rituals that have lost their meaning. It's worth spreading things out before God and asking him if there are any places where our motivation's wrong. He's really good at just coming in with his Holy Spirit and just putting his finger on something, right, just there. I mean, I'm in the practice of trying to fast fairly regularly, but every so often I feel like God kind of goes, is that really about me today? And I'll often stop and just kind of have a day where I'm kind of not doing it, or where actually he just convicts me of it and actually I need to repent about it. And there's a real need to have integrity in who we are tying up with who we appear to be. There's the word seem eager to know my ways, and as if they were a nation that does what's right. Like, there's a real need for us not to seem more sorted than we are. And I guess I'm obviously also mindful about this when you're in a leadership capacity. There's an appropriate level of disclosure. We head up student work, and it's not always appropriate that I go through in great detail every challenge that I've got with those that I'm leading. And at the same time, there's a real need that I don't appear to these students to be more sorted than I am, because otherwise they'll feel like, well, they could never be this spiritual or whatever. So there can just be a tightrope to walk with that one. But there's the need to be vulnerable and show people that we have cracks, because actually that can really encourage them. This also looks a lot about our behaviour when we're worshipping. In this passage, the people were worshipping and their behaviour was terrible. Isaiah talks about the way they behaved while they were fasting: exploiting workers, quarrelling and strife, striking each other, pointing finger, malicious talk, to name but a few. And there's always a call on our lives to act rightly, but dare I say it, that call is even stronger when we are worshipping. There's a couple of Bible passages which I felt just sum this up really beautifully. There's James 3:9-11, which says, "With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who've been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. Brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring?" And it goes on to say, no, they can't. And then Isaiah 29:13 says, "These people come near to me with their mouth and honour me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is based merely on human rules they've been taught." So let's ask God to keep our hearts soft and to help him to help us to worship him with love and integrity. So loving. 1 Corinthians 13 talks all about love, and the whole chapter starts off by saying, "If I speak in the tongues of men or angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal." And then, not the Bible, but actually from Call the Midwife, one of my favourite programmes, it said, there was a wonderful quote in the Christmas special this year which said, "The hands of the Almighty can often be found at the ends of our own arms." And I just loved that. It was in the context of somebody saying, well, why does God never, why does he never even intervene in its situations? And she was saying, so often God just uses us. And actually, I think those two kind of top and tail this quite nicely. Of actually, if we do everything but don't have love in what we're doing, then it's meaningless. But actually, unless we do stuff, then we're not actually outworking that love. So there's a kind of there's a tension to work out here. So after this passage thinks about the heart of worship and fasting, it talks a lot about right living. And there's a bunch of things it asks us to stop, and other things it asks us to do. There seems to be a sort of a wider call, first of all, that challenges sort of global injustice. And then it sort of seems to zoom in and talk about a more local doorstep, kind of around and about yourself, taking care of those around you. I'm not going to speak vastly right now about the global call for righteous living. But I guess at the very least, I'd just like to point out that we should be people who pray about our world, about unjust laws, about oppressive regimes, about leaders, praying for our brothers and sisters in countries where they can't worship freely, thinking particularly about Open Doors. We always get their prayer resources, and they tend to sit in one of our bathrooms and, have the top 50 most oppressed areas, most oppressed countries to be Christians in. And actually it does something in you when you sit down and read about a country where X numbers of Christians got shot for their faith this year or whatever. Actually, these are things that we should be praying about. But actually, I want to speak a little bit more just about the local and infinitely practical the section of Isaiah here, where it's talking about how the nitty-gritty of serving those around us, sharing our food and our homes with those in need, practicing hospitality to those around us. This is messy work, and it is inconvenient. It's talking about opening up our homes and being available, particularly being serving and being there for those who can't repay it as well, providing for those who struggle to provide for themselves. And there's a particular call that it says as well of being there for your family. It talks about not turning away from our own flesh and blood. That can sometimes be a challenging one. It's talking about looking for practical ways to bless those around us. And I think within this, it doesn't talk about it explicitly, but I think there's a real call for us to share spiritual riches with those around us, praying for those who are hurting, sharing truth with them, praying for those who have physical needs, praying for those who are just needing God to break through in their finances, sharing with those around us. And God's also clear in this passage that it's not just it's not just the actions we do, but it's the words we speak. It talks here about doing away with pointing the finger, I guess, particularly in blaming other people, that would be. But also he talks about malicious talk, and later on he talks about idle words, which is not always easy to see exactly what they mean by this, but I guess in particular like gossip and kind of just speaking wrongly about those around us. And there's a really high call to speak rightly and in a way that's fitting of who we are in Christ, keeping away from talk that's unkind and making sure that what we say honours God. I guess again particularly that Ephesians 4 verse, let no unwholesome talk come out of our mouths, only what is only what will build others up, that it will benefit those who listen. Yeah. As a brief aside, I also want to mention that the passage talks quite a lot about the Sabbath. I'm not picking up on that hugely here, but I also don't want to completely ignore it because it says it a few times. I think it's enough to say that actually observing the Sabbath was an Old Testament rule that Jesus came and fulfilled, and as such it doesn't have quite such the same power of us today. Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath, fulfilled the purpose of the Sabbath, and we now have eternal rest in Jesus. However, God himself took a day of rest, and we're designed in his image, and it would be silly to just ignore the Sabbath fully. I think there's a real call for us to make sure that we pace our lives in a good way, but I'm not going to go into it much more than that. And so lastly, that God's blessing flows when our hearts are right. And if we go back to the pipe image, I feel like we've thought about removing a good few handfuls of muck of the wrong ways of living, things that were blocking the communication with God. And the pipes are now freer, and they've been shored up if you think about the principles of living rightly. And then Isaiah starts talking about the blessings that freely flow once we're living rightly. Open communication with God, healing quickly appearing, security with righteousness going before us and the glory of the Lord going behind us. Praying and seeing God answer. Guidance always. Resources both internal and external. One of the commentaries talked about health and life of the soul, particularly in a sun-scorched land. I liked that. It's talking about resources. Resources perhaps from beyond us, but also resources that God's, wells of water within us. At times that feel like a desert, actually, there are resources of God to well up in us and sustain us through those times. Rebuilding the ancient ruins and raising up of the age-old foundations, repairer of broken walls and restorer of streets of dwellings. One of the commentaries here talked about restoring things that have been destroyed, but also I wonder if there's something of being people who restore things that have fallen into disuse. And as I was kind of pondering on this, I felt particularly like perhaps there was a call to be people who see the fulfilling of prophetic words, in a ministry of reconciliation and seeing built, like walls that have been broken down actually build up again. I mean, not in the negative sense of seeing walls, but as in being people who see things that have broken down actually start building up again. And then the passage finishes with, "Then you will find your joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in a triumph on the heights of the land and to feed on the inheritance of your father Jacob." And we talked earlier about it being really great to do things because we want to obey God and not just to, because we want something from him. But in God's style, he doesn't then just kind of bless us a little bit in response. God is in the business of abundant blessing. It's a kind of opening the floodgates and the living water flowing freely through the pipes and abundant life springing forth. I guess in this picture I was thinking about oasis in the desert, but I was thinking particularly, and I couldn't find the exact bit I looked for. In Planet Earth, there was a picture at one point of kind of a desert, just like you have in the background, and then some water starts flowing, and it's come from mountains miles and miles and miles and miles away. And as it flows, all these seeds which had lain dormant, that have been blown over the years, within days they were kind of bursting up around the place, and the desert was actually like this lush place of river and water, and there was all this life that came with the water. And I guess there's something of the abundance of that in a land which seems dry and arid before. There's some water that flows, and this kind of, it's not quite a rainforest, but there's this green lush landscape bursts forth from it. And I think there was something of this picture of living water coming and pouring on dry land when we set ourselves to live rightly before God. Where there was barrenness, the water brings forth abundant life, not just a righting of what was wrong, but an abundant blessing, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together and running over, as it talks about in the Gospels. So to finish, I want us to just pause and ponder and to say, where are our hearts? So I guess there are three questions I thought in terms of responding to this. Firstly, are our hearts right before God? Is our worship true and pleasing to him? It could be that actually God's just, when I was talking about that, was something that God just nudged something in you that was like, you're doing this worship, but actually the motivation's just got slightly off kilter over the years or whatever. So it could be that there's something that God wants to speak to you about that in terms of whether our worship is true and pleasing to him. Could be, is his love practically evident in our lives? What are we doing that actually practically shows God's love to those around us? And actually, it's really easy to be doing stuff like that and then life to throw you a different situation, and then you suddenly find that you're living quite insular lives. Even just preparing this, I was really challenged. We're in the middle of trying to move house, and I was aware that how much kind of the stuff of life comes in and clutters, and then you're like, I just need to realign my vision again and ask God, what it is that he wants me to be doing. Because even amongst the busyness, there are still things he'd have me doing and serving other people. And is God's blessing flowing? I felt this question was a slightly more interesting one. But this passage is really clear that if we do these things, there is an abundant blessing that flows. And I guess I wanted to ask, are there people who feel like God's blessing just seems a bit stuck in their lives, and where the image of living waters just maybe not resonating? And I think if that's the case, I wonder if, I think this morning, there'll be a little bit of time, but it may well be a longer thing of getting together with some people that you know and trust, and just praying with them and being like, I feel like there's a blockage here, and I want to see that move. And it could be that God highlights, one or two things that you're like, ooh, that needs to change in me or something. So I think that's probably a longer term one, but I did feel that there's a promise in this passage that God's blessing flows when we live rightly. And actually, we're here as the family of God to help each other do that. So I don't know if it works to you, perhaps sing something or have a moment to reflect on some of these things. And then I'm going to hand over to Andy.